Because of discrimination in the publishing industry during the time, Hurston never made a lot of money from her writing. The largest royalty she ever received from any of her books was $973, and the largest advance she ever received from a publisher was $500, when white writers at the time were routinely receiving $5,000 advances. Soon her daunting economic situation and political castigations would be compounded by her failing health. Carla Kaplan.
In the 1950s, because she was unable to publish, because she was no longer a radio personality as she had been in the 1930s and 40s, she was finding it extremely difficult just to get enough money to live, and she took a series of very difficult jobs which were also hard on her health. Unfortunately, one of those jobs was as a maid in Revo Island, Florida. And she took that job as a maid when she published one of the last published stories of her life and of her writing career in the Saturday Evening Post. Unfortunately, a reporter found out that she was working as a maid at the time that story came out, and it actually became a national story. Zora Neale Hurston working as a maid, quote, just to live a little. So she found herself once again humiliated in the national press, and that seemed to increase her difficulties.
Hurston was extremely independent. Although it is known that she had been married 3 times, none of her marriages lasted longer than 1 year. In January of 1960, and far from the dazzling limelight of her literary success, Hurston died a lonely, uncelebrated, and penniless death in Fort Pierce, Florida. There was no money even for a gravestone.
Hurston did indeed happen to die without money.
Carla Kaplan.
When she died, everything that she owned, if you did not have money and you lived in South Florida in the late 1950s or the 1960s, typically what would happen to your personal effects is that they would all be gathered up and taken out back behind your house and burned. That was the most typical way to destroy the personal effects of poor people and poor people of color at the time. Everything that she had owned was gathered up from her little 2-room house, piled up, and it was set on fire. At the time, fortunately, a young local black deputy sheriff in his 20s, a man named Pat Duvall, happened to be driving by, and he saw the little plume of smoke, and he said to himself, somebody must have died. And he started to get a little closer, mostly out of curiosity. And as he got a little closer, he began to think, that could be Miss Hurston's house, because everyone in the neighborhood had known for months that she was suffering. She had had a series of strokes. She had been paralyzed on one side for weeks. The community had been looking after her every day, bringing her food, checking up on her, and he knew that she had been quite ill. So he started driving faster and faster, and as he got closer and closer, he realized, oh my goodness, that is Miss Hurston's house. He was driving one of those huge cruisers that you would have driven at the time with the big tail fins. And he says he slammed that car into the curb, left the engine running, and went running into the back of the house, where the yard man on instructions was tending a bonfire, and Pat Duvall, yelling, get a hose, get a hose, get a hose, started putting out that bonfire with his bare hands, because he knew what a gift Zora Neale Hurston had, how precious everything she had written was, what a terrible national tragedy it was if her personal effects, which would include most of her carbon copies of letters and her manuscripts in particular, were burned and destroyed. And he successfully put out most of that fire, both with his hands and with a hose. And then he gathered all of those sopping wet, half-burned papers, and he piled them in his trunk, and he piled them on the back seat of his car, and he took them back to his house, where he set them on his screen porch, still steaming and dripping wet. And his wife said, what do you think you're doing? And he said, these are Miss Hurston's things. They include, among other things, Hurston's last known novel called Herod the Great.
Hurston's death could have been the event that cemented her place in permanent obscurity. Her artistic endeavors and aesthetic achievements to forever lay in the shadow of her counter-revolutionary status. But a movement that began with Alice Walker's pivotal essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which appeared in Ms. Magazine in 1974, has led to a literary resurrection of Zora Neale Hurston. Robert Hemingway wrote the first biography on Zora Neale Hurston and tells how her legacy, some 15 years after her death, took on a new direction.
I wrote an essay on how Zora Neale Hurston was buried in an unmarked grave in St. Lucie County, Florida, Fort Pierce, Florida. And Alice saw that essay in that book and said, this just isn't right, that Zora Neale Hurston, who I admire so much as a writer and as a woman, that she should be in an unmarked grave. So Alice Walker went to Fort Pierce, Florida, and sort of went out to the Garden of the Heavenly Rest, which was a segregated cemetery in Fort Pierce, Florida. And Alice determined where she thought that Zora Neale Hurston was buried and went and paid for a headstone to be put on that gravesite. Read Zora Neale Hurston, Genius of the South, folklorist, novelist, anthropologist, 1901, 1960. And Alice has always blamed me for not getting the dates right because I made her the dates she put on the gravestone wrong because she, as I say, we now know she was born in 1891, but we didn't know that when I was writing that essay and Alice was putting the gravestone down.
No longer subjected to the biases imposed by the political identity of the 1920s and 30s, contemporary observers and scholars continue to analyze Hurston's personal and cultural identity through new evaluative criteria, opening Hurston and other African American literary figures up to greater valorization and ultimately expanding the canon of American literature. After a lifetime of public and professional scrutiny, her work emerges as some of the most profound and accurate documentation of rural Southern folklore existing today. Despite unrelenting criticism from the most powerful and respected Black elite, Hurston embraced the Southern agrarian, an aesthetic targeted for elimination by the cultural sphere of the Harlem Renaissance. And her folklore collections, ethnographies, effective use of authentic dialogue, and African American cultural traditions have all led to her posthumous canonical status. Today, Hurston is one of the most influential, widely read, and celebrated personalities of the Harlem Renaissance. Her work is the subject of ongoing scholarly review, her life and her legacy inspiring new plays, lectures, biographies, radio and television documentaries, movies, festivals, and even postal stamps. N.Y. Nathiri, historian and director of the annual Zora Neale Hurston Festival in Eatonville, Florida, provides perhaps the perfect explanation for Hurston's rise from obscurity.
The sad reality of being born before your time is that you have to die, and others have to come afterwards to appreciate what you're doing, how you have dedicated your life. You must remember that when we began this work in 1987, that in Orange County, Florida, Zora Neale Hurston was not a known quantity. I mean, people would say, what Zora? What is a Zora? Who is Zora Neale Hurston? If it were not for the careful and meticulous work of Zora Neale Hurston's documenting the life and folkways of rural African-descended Americans, we would not have those authentic traditions. So apart from Zora Neale Hurston, in this instance, she certainly was a pioneer, and her work constitutes the body of folkways of Black rural Southerners. She has made the world of the rural Black Southerner known to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who read her material. So I would say that she plays a seminal role in our understanding the first, say, 40 years of the 20th century from a rural Southern Black perspective. She's a cultural preservationist. She wants to make certain that the people coming afterwards, generation after generation, know their antecedents and the rich culture of their antecedents and of them, who they are, what is their essence.
Hurston didn't feel the pressure, or she just ignored the pressure for women to marry.
Cheryl Wall.
She ignored the pressure for women to mother children. She was very much intent on following her own way to become an artist at a time when that wasn't something that black women did. To become an educated woman, which was rare, of course, in itself, and then to use that education to document the expressions of uneducated Black Americans. So she just made her own path, decided what she believed in, and adhered to those beliefs. I think the way that Hurston used language is, of course, the most important legacy that she leaves to other writers. One can see allusions to Hurston's work in writing by Gloria Naylor, Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison, Paul Marshall, Ishmael Reed, George Wolfe, and of course Alice Walker. And I'm only scratching the surface of the list.
The literary world has finally come to realize the historical, social, and cultural significance of Zora Neale Hurston. According to Alice Walker, Hurston was a trailblazer, a black woman who followed her own road, believed in her own gods, pursued her own dreams, and refused to separate herself from common people. Folklore is the arts of the people, Hurston wrote, before they find out that there is any such thing as art. Today, she is recognized as an acclaimed literary artist, anthropologist, and preservationist who stood in defiance and defense of those she loved and respected most, those she called farthest down.
Hurston would go down to a work camp, say a turpentine still, or a camp where a railroad camp or something like that, where they were building railroads across the South in the 1920s. She would take a guitar with her and go down to the juke joint on the job on Saturday night and say, do you know any blues or do you know any songs? And she'd say, here's one I know. And then before long, she would be trading blues lyrics and melodies with whoever the man was or the woman was who was sitting there playing guitar on the juke joint on the job. And there's just a little blues called Halimafact that she collected that, to me, I can just sort of imagine Zora Neale Hurston singing this and trading songs with somebody and collecting this. And she said, when I collect the blues like this, I keep repeating it until the people are in the group tell me that I've got it right, and then I carry it with me wherever I go.